Tonight we've got two presentations. The first one is looking at evidence for a fairly recent global flood. The second one is looking at the dating issue of the age of the Earth, how the age of the Earth is conventionally dated, and what are the different ways that the age of the Earth can be measured. And essentially what I'm looking at is some of the most recent data we have and how this essentially is all pointing to a relatively young age for the age of the Earth. Yesterday, just to recap for those of you who might not have been here, essentially the theory of evolution is composed of two components, or the evolutionary worldview. You've got chemical evolution, where non-living molecules, sort of as the Earth was being formed, somehow came together and formed all the chemical components to form the first living cell. And we looked at the complex mechanisms, even in a simple cell, that involve the code that encodes all the components of the cell, the code reader, and then the little factories that convert the information picked up by the code reader into the actual components of the cell that are then assembled into the cell itself. So we can see there's a lot of complex machinery, and this machinery itself is encoded for in the code, that the code is just so highly complex that it really is beyond the comprehension of most of us to understand its complexity. The theory of evolution requires that this complex code arose by chance. And it's sort of like imagining that the history of China, written in a book, could somehow arise by just random hitting letters on a typewriter. And we can do probability calculations on that, and it's just impossible. It would never happen. Putting a 3-year-old hitting the keys on a typewriter would never write the history of China out. And so we can see that both mathematically and biochemically that's impossible. Further, we've looked at the experiments that have been done and the requirements for life in a living cell, and we find that there are about 4 or 5 essential components that have to be formed in the laboratory. We've been able to form the first ones. But from then on, we haven't been able to successfully form the polymers by some simple mechanism, let alone the structure, let alone all the complex chemical reactions. So we don't have experimental data. Then the second part of evolution is sort of the new Darwinian type evolution, which says that, say, a fish evolved into an amphibian over time, and over time this evolved, the amphibian evolved into a reptile in a bird, by different mechanisms over time. We saw requires huge amounts of new code. Huge amounts of new code. We saw that a bacteria has about, say, 4.5 million pieces of code. When we go to a yeast, we go to about 12 million pieces of code. When we go to a tiny little worm, half a centimetre long, we go to about 97 million pieces of code. When we go to higher organisms like a mammal, we're going to 2.5 billion pieces of code. So we see there's massive amounts, and then that would be just for one mammal. We've got 5,000 existing mammals. Many more existed in the past. So this type of evolution, which produces new code, has not been observed in the laboratory. Even though we've bred fruit fly, we've bred bacteria through tens of thousands of generations, and these organisms have been observed, and they turn over very quickly. Mutations that we generally see that produce evolutionary changes, like Darwin talked about the wingless beetles on the windy side of the island that had the advantage they survived better because they didn't get blown out to sea. That was the loss of code that produced where their wings didn't develop fully, and therefore there was an advantage. So the examples that we can actually measure and observe today all revolve around the loss of code, not the generation of new code. So that was essentially what we looked at. The other time factor that evolution requires is very long periods of time. And, but even then, really, there isn't enough, because we know that about 100 to 200 million different species have existed. Only about 1 or 2% are still alive. The rest have become extinct. So in actual fact, what we observe, what we can actually observe, is the loss of code, the massive loss of code, not new code forming. And, and we can do a simple calculation that we should see complete new species evolving every 3 to 5 years. But we haven't been able to observe anything. And we've been able to make good observations, at least for the past 100 years. So this is a clear example of the lack of information for evolution. So we have the lack of observed data for actual evolution. Biochemically, it's impossible. Mathematically, it's improbable. Now, one of the other features and how evolution came to be as a theory, of course, is on the basis of the fossil record. And essentially, a couple of things that happened was that James Hutton, around the end of the 1700s, proposed that the Earth was much older than the 6,000 years or so, according to Ussher's Bible chronology, and that these processes and rocks were formed over millions of years. And Lyell took that that concept. He was a young lawyer who was interested in studying rocks, and he took that concept and he studied the rocks, and particularly the layers of the fossils in the Alps. And he noticed that the further up the fossil record, the fossils seemed to be more complex organisms. And he proposed the original geologic column, and this concept that these rocks represented long periods of time. And he just essentially estimated the period of time based on sediment rates, where they saw the deposition of sediment at river mouths and so forth. Before then, there'd be another guy by the name of William Smith, who'd been digging canals in London, and he'd noticed that when he dug a canal over here, there were the same sequence of, or particular sequence of rock types. There might be limestone, followed by pebbles, followed by a sandstone, followed by a limestone layer, and that there were particular fossils in these different layers. And then he would be digging a canal 20 miles away and find the same layers. And essentially he proposed that the layers could be identified by the fossils in them. So Lyell had taken this concept that had been developed by William Smith and applied it in terms of a column. And that was really his discovery, and put him on the map. And he published Principles of Geology in the early 1830s. Now, it's interesting that Charles Darwin was given a copy of Principles of Geology when he went on his journey on the Beagle. And when he went to was travelling around the different parts, and he saw the different animals, and of course on the Galapagos Islands, he saw the different animals and the different shaped beaks on the birds, and he'd been studying breeding of birds and animals and this sort of thing, and he proposed that there were particular mutations that gave an advantage and they survived better. And it certainly was a brilliant piece of work. Charles Lyell, with his millions of years, gave enough time for this to happen. And so the fossil records seem to confirm evolution. But Darwin had a doubt. There was a couple of things actually that nagged in his mind. That was the structure of the eye. How could the eye evolve, the eye structure evolve? A lot of components in the eye. But one of his doubts was this. One of the oldest rock levels that we find fossils in is called the Cambrian. And that's dated conventionally about 600 million years old. And below that, in the Precambrian, they have found a few fossils of algae and maybe possibly little tiny worm tracky things. There's nothing really clear. But what happens is, when you get into the Cambrian, you suddenly find a whole lot of fully developed, very complex animals with no developmental ancestors leading up to them. And this was a major problem. Well, I don't have a video for you tonight, but let me read something that I've written, because it says it better than perhaps I will off the cuff. According to the theory of evolution, highly complex animals such as trilobites and nautiloids must have evolved over long periods of time. Yet there is no evidence of their evolution. In Norway, under the lower Cambrian trilobites, there is 4,000 feet of strata that contain no fossils. In Morocco, under the lower Cambrian trilobites, there are 3,000 feet of strata containing anacrocyanal or reef-building organisms as fossils, and under this strata there's another 10,000 feet of limestone that contain only stromatolites, that is, fossils of algae. In the Inyo Mountains of California, there are strata more than 14,000 feet thick that contain fossils of trilobites and anacrocyanidés. Then under this formation is 7,000 feet of unfossilised strata. Professor W. Charles Bell, former professor of geology at the University of Texas, points out that similar patterns of thousands of feet of non-fossil containing strata immediately underlie the Cambrian trilobite containing strata that occur in Australia and Eastern Asia. In other words, in thousands of metres of conformable strata, and I'll explain what that means in a moment, we find no evidence of evolution, just a sudden appearance of fully formed, complex animals. Professor Bell further points out that the Cambrian fossil record contains representatives of every important invertebrate animal phyla, suddenly appearing with no fossil evidence of evolution. Now, by conformable, what I mean is that these layers are laid down on top of one another with no signs of erosion in between, yet they're claimed to be millions of years possibly apart. So we have these layers laid down, no evidence of erosion in between, and then suddenly we have the layers with highly complex, fully formed animals. Like nautiluses have very complex jet propulsion system. They're known to be a highly intelligent hunter, fully developed eyes and digestive system, reproductive system, and so forth. The same with trilobites. You see the pictures of them, fully developed eyes, compound eyes, segmented bodies, many legs, fully developed, highly complex reproductive system, and segmented. A lot of code to make those animals. A lot of evolution has to take place to form those animals. Now, that was a major problem for the theory of evolution, and Darwin recognised that, and I write about it in that particular chapter in my book. And shortly after my book was published, Stephen Meyer, the Cambridge educated philosopher of science, put out a book where he took my 30-page, well, he didn't take my chapter, but he took the sort of arguments that I have in the 30 pages of my chapter and expanded them into this book, nearly 500 pages, with over 600 references. And what he has done is he has thoroughly explored the Cambrian fossil evidence and showed unequivocally that it is impossible for evolution to occur. Now, this book, which came out, has been the #1 seller in the area of paleontology for quite a time. I don't know what it is now on Amazon, but it's been a very, very strong seller. There's over 500 reviews of this book on Amazon. It has created a huge stir in the evolutionary circles because he lists the scientific peer-reviewed papers that show that evolution could not have happened. It's a very, very powerful book. You can see it on Amazon, look it up, read the reviews, over 500 reviews. So we have major problems with the fossil record, we have major problems with the biochemistry, we have a lot. So what's the alternative? And the Bible account says that essentially the world was created in a short period of time, short time ago, and then there was a massive flood that destroyed most of life on Earth, and that occurred only about 4,500 years ago. So what evidence do we have for this claim? Because once we go back prior to that time, our only way of knowing is what we have been given in some sort of historical record, such as the Bible. And Bible is one of the oldest historical records that has been preserved to us, that has been passed down. And it's interesting, as I talked to students at the university yesterday, what surprised me was the amazing lack of knowledge about what the Bible actually says and the history of the Bible. And it seemed that these students don't know how much scholarship has actually gone into the Bible and verifying the Bible and its accuracy in terms of archaeology and so forth at major universities like Oxford, University of Chicago and so forth. A lot of research has been done. It's a very important document. So tonight I'm going to look at the evidence for the flood on the basis of what we can look at and know now. So maybe if I press this little button, something will happen. So this is where we'll have a look now at the evidence for the flood. When we look at the geology textbooks, we find that a number of them mention extinctions, global extinctions that occurred at different time periods. For example, during the Cretaceous, essentially they say the Earth was covered by water. And that's when those limestone deposits were laid down. And there are 4 or 5 major extinction events that they say occur. Because when we look at the structure of the Earth, we find that the surface of the Earth is covered with this thin layer of sediment that was essentially laid down underwater. So a large proportion of the material that constitutes the surface of the Earth has been laid down underwater conditions, and then you have volcanic intrusions coming up, and then you have the mountain ranges pushed up too, so that you have the fossils up on the mountain ranges, like in Peru and the Himalayas and so forth. So they say that these aqueous extinction events occurred over millions of years and millions of years apart. The Bible says that they were one global event. So let's have a look at the data that we have. One of the things is that when we see these massive deposits, and we'll have a look at how big they are absolutely massive. They represent events that we don't see happening on this scale today. And geologists recognise that. For a while there was a time when they didn't recognise it. Up till probably Lyell's time, flood geology was taught at Oxford. Lyell's principles of geology then took over and influenced people, and Hutton's uniformitarianism theories. But now geologists realise, hang on, that doesn't work. There's powerful evidence of massive catastrophic events on the surface of our Earth. So here we have a picture of the Grand Canyon. It's interesting, last week I was at the Grand Canyon on the Sunday, so tomorrow a week ago, and had a look at this. And it's amazing. Oh, let's go back there a little bit. You can't see it so clearly, but if you look at other pictures on the internet or in books, so many of those layers are parallel. There's no signs of erosion in between the layers, and yet they represent millions of years, many of them, apart. So how can you have that layer just sitting there and there's no erosion? And yet they say, look at all this massive erosion that's taken place that's eroded this, mile-deep canyon. So what that suggests is those layers must have been laid down very quickly. And many of them contain fossils, which represent, life and so forth. And this is a major problem. That's the conformity problem. The fact that all these layers are laid down. If they're millions of years apart, how come there's no erosion? That's a major, major problem. But these are huge. If we consider the Morrison Formation, where a lot of the dinosaurs are found, they stretch from New Mexico to Canada. So you've got this massive sedimentary deposit that is absolutely huge. It's thousands of miles long, a couple of thousand miles long. It's huge. You need a massive event to be pushing that amount of sediment and a massive amount of water, amazing conditions to produce that. The chalk beds that you hear about the White Cliffs of Dover. Well, those particular chalk beds of the Cretaceous stretch from Ireland through to Turkey. They're the same as where you see the Christian caves and so forth in Cappadocia. It's the same bed of limestone. It stretches several thousand kilometres across Europe there. So here we have a little pointery thing, so you can see you've got a massive bed of limestone that was deposited like this over that huge area there. So to do that, and these similar Cretaceous limestones, they occur here in Australia, they occur in North America, all deposited at the same time. And that's why, as I said, geologists proposed that the Earth was essentially covered with water at that time. So there you've got the White Cliffs of Dover. There you've got the limestone at Cappadocia. So coal beds are similar. We have got massive coal beds that stretch across Europe to the Caspian Sea. We've got the massive coal beds that occur in Australia that we all know about. We've got the Coconino sandstones, which stretch from Arizona and Kansas, Oklahoma and Texas. And as we measure the cross beds, that's these, you have the layers, but also you can see sort of like a curved bed where the sand has been moving along, carried by the water. We can actually do calculations. Geologists do calculations so they can estimate the rate of travel of the water. And we can see the water is moving quite fast, not a sea. This is moving water that is depositing these sands. And look at the size of how much is deposited. 42,000 cubic kilometres. That's a lot of material. That's a massive flood. Like a couple of years ago, an area of Queensland the size of New South Wales was flooded. But we didn't see any fossilisation of goannas and kangaroos or anything like that occurring. It just blows our mind the type of event that occurred that is responsible to move 42,000 cubic kilometres of material and spread it over thousands of square miles. Right? So this is data we can go and measure it now. And so, there you've got the United States. You can see a massive area here where you've got massive deposits of those particular beds that were laid down over a huge area. And the bedding is essentially fat, very little surface erosion, parallel, rapid deposition, no time for erosion. And yet under conventional dating, millions of years apart, it's not fitting. It's just not adding up. Here we've got a bit of a cross-sectional diagram of the different major strata in the Grand Canyon there. And some of them do have little wiggles, but many of them are just straight. Now, creatures that are rapidly decomposed are preserved, and there are actual action fossils, indicating again that these animals were buried very quickly under catastrophic conditions, and a lot of layers were sent down. So what happened was, when Lyell was doing his calculations, he was working right. You got millimetre deposited per year. If it's a metre thick, then that's 1,000 years. But you can't take, several thousand years to bury a dinosaur. It's all those layers have to go down very rapidly, but therefore they can't be representing tens of thousands or millions of years. But that's how those original timescales came up, assuming uniformitarian deposits and measuring the thickness of the deposits and the overall and calculating the time to put it out to deposit based on uniformitarianism. But we know it must have been a catastrophe. So there's a whole disconnect there. The way the ages are calculated, assuming uniform conditions over a long period of time, but when we observe the deposition, it must have occurred very rapidly, not over a long period of time. Therefore, you can't apply that calculation. Here we've got a picture from a fossil from a museum in Germany showing a particular creature giving birth. Here's another one from another museum of a fossil of a fish eating another fish. There's another one there. So here we have rapid action fossils. This guy is actually an Adventist paleontologist. He's studying the remains of a whale fossil in the Andes Mountains, up on the top of the Andes Mountains there. And these have been exposed. They're near the surface. Now notice, whoops, back. Notice the baleen is still in place. That usually becomes separated very quickly. These show that these whales were buried very quickly. And of course, you're not going to bury a whale with just a little flood, are you? It's going to take a massive flood to bury a whale. And you can see the size. And there's another one up there in the mountains of Peru. So there's a whole bed of fossil whales that they've been working on up there. Again, sometimes they say, well, hang on, the paleontologists don't believe that though. But that's not true. Here we've got, for example, David Ropp, the curator of geology in the Field Museum of Natural History at the University of Chicago, and past president of the Paleontological Society, observes that present-day geologists do not actually find the gradual unfolding of life in the geological record. And yet that's the claim of the theory of evolution. So the actual evidence that was originally the foundation of the theory of evolution is actually not observed. We don't observe that. And this is just not me saying this. These are authorities in the area. What geologists find in the fossil record is species appearing in the geological sequences very suddenly, like Stephen Meyer pointed out in his book there, highly referenced, as I said, appearing in the geological sequences very suddenly, showing little or no change during their existence, so they're not evolving during the time that we find them, and then they're no longer found. They do not find evidence of evolution. Also, we find fossils of creatures the same as creatures still exist today. They have not changed or evolved. And so just out the back here near Wollombi, of course, they've found those Wollombi pines down the bottom of the sinkholes. In 1938, some fishermen caught alive coelacanth finch, which was last supposedly lived 380 million years ago. So, and there are many examples like this now. And again, no evolution has occurred. Here we see fossilised remains, in this case in amber, of insects, and there's the coelacanth fossil. And so Harvard University paleontologist Professor Stephen Jay Gould conceded that there was an absence of fossil evidence in the intermediates, for the intermediate stages required for the major evolutionary transitions. So it's again, and many people have heard of Gould at Harvard there. And this guy is, wrong pointer. This guy is very interesting, Eugene Koonin. And that's a good reference to look up. He is really on the ball. He's one of the top biologists in the world. And he's the guy that is saying, hang on guys, you can't have the code and the code reader evolving at the same time. Just doesn't work. He's speaking out and saying, look, we got major problems. And it's interesting when you read some of the literature, some of the comments, the other biologists say, hey, Koonin, just tone it down a little bit. Don't keep saying these things. But there's some very interesting articles there. And what it's saying is we don't have the evidence of the transitional species that evolutionists claim occur with these species. Your fish changing slowly into your amphibian, your reptile changing into a bird. The intermediates aren't there. There might be half a dozen, a handful of possible intermediate creatures, that are interesting, that you could argue over. But it's irrelevant because there should be thousands upon thousands of fossils of intermediates. When insects appear, there should be somehow a development of a worm into an insect, somehow the development of wings and flight. We don't find it. Insects fully appear in the fossil record. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself now. But here we go, next slide. Insect authority, Dr. Robert Wooden from the University of Exeter notes that when the fossil insects first appear in the geological column, flying is fully developed. This requires a huge amount of new genetic code to arise from mutations. This is impossible from probability basis, etc. And this is what we find over and over again. For example, turtles just suddenly appear in the fossil record. There are no fossil ancestors to turtles. But yet there should be, if evolution was true. There should be a slow development leading to the development of a turtle. And so this lack of evidence of evolution, what do we find in the fossil record? Fully formed animals, already fully functioning. not examples of animals developing with partly developed bits and pieces. So here we have moths and so forth. So we can see that from the basis of what the fossils, we can go out and measure now the evidence for evolution there. Often too, the character, in the textbooks opposite the geological column, they'll have certain particular types of fossils listed that they find. For example, you won't usually find mammals portrayed with dinosaurs, but yet mammals coexisted with dinosaurs. We have the fossils together. And so there's all this misconception that, hang on, there was this progression, but in actual fact the fossil record is much more mixed up than that. So what I'm saying is, when we go out now and observe the fossil record, which we can go out now, where we can tell it's reproducible science, there's not the evidence for evolution there. What we have, though, is we have records down through history and different cultures of a global flood. And you can see up there a table that 95% of these flood events related to a flood type of catastrophe, rather than, say, a fire or a meteorite or something like that. And you can see there that the characteristics of the Bible, that the Bible summarises in the Genesis account of the flood, are listed there. Particularly interesting, for example, is the flood was due to the wickedness of mankind, occurs in about 2/3 of the accounts that survived. It's interesting that a boat, rainbows being mentioned, is fairly small, but 8 people saved is fairly high. Am I reading this correctly? Or is that the 9 one, is it? 9. Okay. So the rainbow mentioned, 3/4, so that's interesting, but a special family. Anyway, you can see the data there. So this is very interesting because these are cultures from around the world that are reporting this prior to the impact of missionaries and so forth. A number of different historians have studied this. Also, the description of the ark in the Bible is very realistic. Its dimensions are similar to an ocean-type kayak to sustain very rough water. Its particular dimensions, whereas, say, if you look at the Greek account, it's a cube, and some of the other accounts you can see they've been corrupted, the other pagan-type accounts. And a number of people have studied the size of this ark. Last year, about this time, my wife and I were in Hong Kong. And a Hong Kong billionaire has actually built a full-size replica of the ark. It's located just under a freeway. There's Colleen. There's the length of the ark there. And it is built to the actual dimensions. There you can see the freeway. Well, actually, it's the approach to a bridge from one island to the next island. It's a huge bridge, multi-lane bridge, 8-lane bridge. And you can see the size of the ark there and the size of the people. When you walk inside, you see, no problem to fit all the animals in there. And so there's some figures there where the ark has been calculated, and one guy has gone into quite a lot of detail to research the feasibility that would fit the different kinds of animals. And remember, we were talking about different kinds of animals. So, for example, we probably only had a couple of dogs in there. And those dogs, being very early on in the part of creation, would have had very large genetic codes, which encoded for a huge amount of variation. And then over the period of time, selection has selected out, and we have a large range of different types of dogs today. And that would go for all the different animals, the elephants and the dinosaurs and alligators and so forth, and insects. So, and only the animals that breathed were taken on the ark. So it's a fairly realistic account, really, especially compared to some of the other accounts from the other pagan cultures. So in terms of what we know today and measure, the ark account is quite realistic. The other thing is the actual chronologies that are given, which are quite interesting. We don't have many ancient records that have survived. Now, the Bible talks about people up to the flood living quite long ages. 900 years. And then after the flood, the age is declining. And I want to talk a little bit about this. But anyway, we see that according to the Bible dating, and we have the Bible dating is essentially based on the year at which Solomon built his temple. There's a bit of a dispute over that. There's about a 50-year range of when Solomon built his temple, but from that we can, which was somewhere between 950 and 1000 BC, or maybe 960 and 1010 BC, somewhere around then. And but from that date we have pretty accurate ages of patriarchs and when they became fathers. So, but the guy might say that so-and-so was 60 years old when he begat so-and-so. Was he 60 years and 1 month or 60 years and 11 months? So again, over 10 patriarchs, you've got an error of plus 10 years. There are 10 patriarchs before the flood and 10 after the flood. So you've got an error there of plus 20 years, plus the uncertainty in the date of Solomon's temple. So you've got an overall uncertainty of about 70 years. But in between, otherwise, we appear to have a fairly complete chronology. So on that basis, we had the flood at 2348 BC, plus or minus, or plus 70 years. And then at 2080 BC, you have got Terah born, who was Abraham's father, and then you had Noah dying. So Abraham's father was still alive while Noah was still alive. So obviously information about what it was like before the flood and so forth could easily be passed on. Then just after Noah dies, Abraham was born, but after 50 years or so later, after that, Shem dies, who was Noah's son, who was also on the ark. So here we have a sort of a record, and it's sort of like my father was born in 1907, which is over 100 years ago. But I met my grandma, right, who was born back in the 1870s. And so, quite quickly you can go back quite a long period of time in someone's memory. So so I had relatives who I remember talking to relatives who were, whose parents were alive during the Civil War in America, for example. So here we see Moses born not that long afterwards, who wrote the account down. And of course, Jesus quotes with authority Moses' account and corroborates Moses' account. So here we show that the accounts could very easily be passed down. Now we have other secular records that have survived. So after Alexander the Great defeated Darius at Gaugamela in 331 BC, he journeyed to Babylon, and there he received 1,903 years of astronomical observations from the Chaldeans, which they claim dated back to the founding of Babylon. So this was a historical record that he was given, that the Chaldeans claim went back to their foundation. And so when you do the calculation, then you can see that Babylon was founded 2234 BC, or about 68 to 114 years after the flood, and 33 years before the birth of Peleg. And of course, we may add 70 years uncertainty into there as well. So that's interesting because this is a secular record that dates the founding of Babylon after the flood. Constantine Manassas, who died in 1187 AD, wrote that the Egyptian state lasted 1663 years. Now, if correct, counting backward from the time of Cambyses, the king of Persia, conquered Egypt 526 BC, that gives the year of 2188 BC for the founding of Egypt, or 13 years after the scattering of peoples, or about 114 to 160 years after the flood. It would be during the time of Mizraim, the son of Ham, the son of Noah. Mizraim led his group into Egypt, hence the Hebrew word for Egypt is Mizraim. So any of you have an old encyclopedia at home, you'll find that Egypt is not called Egypt, it's called Mizraim. Egypt was named after Noah's grandson. And of course the Bible refers to it as the land of Ham, which was Egypt's father as well. So many of these places are named after the people who were Noah's grandsons or great-grandsons. And, think about it. You don't name countries after fictitious people. Even Disneyland is named after Walter Disney. It's not Mickey Mouse Land, and Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes and so forth. So this is very high credibility that Egypt is named after Noah's grandson. And the ancient Egyptian historians confirmed that. Another one, a 4th century historian Eusebius of Caesarea, he said that Igliaus, the king of the Greek city of Sychon, began his reign in 1,313 years before the first Olympiad, which was in 776 BC, so that puts it about 2080 BC. And so if Eusebius is correct, then the first Greek king started about 112 to 150 years after the dividing of the people. So that's after Egypt. It's a bit further away. And we see that here we've got records from 3 different secular cultures, each speaking a different language, and these ancient historical kingdoms confirm or corroborate realistically with the Bible ages. When we come to Chinese history, the oldest surviving text, the Bamboo Annals, because most of them were destroyed about the time of Christ by a ruling emperor at that time in China, but one that survived. The first royal house in China was established by the ruler and sage Fuxi in 1994 BC, and that's from Encyclopedia Britannica. That's from Professor Dunlop's work, Professor of Chinese History at the University of Columbia, one of the top unis in the US, top state unis in the US. And that is 107 years after the scattering of the people. Matter of fact, Young, in his concordance, believes that from the traditions that he researched, that Noah was believed to have been the founder of China, that Noah moved to China. Very interesting. Of course, the Chinese language, the ancient form of the language, is very pictorial and depicts the ark and so forth, and Eden. There's a lot written on that separately. So when we summarise this, we can see a very realistic account of the development of the nations after the flood. And remembering that day of the flood may be pushed back maybe 70 years, maybe there is a bit of missing chronology, we don't know. But what we're saying is that the best chronologies that we have, where they're actual chronologies, secular chronologies, where they've given dates based on ancient documents. Many of them were destroyed, for example, during the big fire in Alexandria when the library was destroyed there and so forth. But those that survived, they all corroborate the Bible independently, the Bible for the formation of civilization. Now, of course, people date it older, but that's because they date artefacts with radiometric dating, and everyone is trying to push back their civilization older and older and older to have the oldest civilization. But when we look at the actual records and the actual best data we have, fits the Bible record. When we look at the table of the nations, we see Egypt is settled as a land of Ham. Again, so Egypt's name is just the Greek version of Mizraim. And Manetho, who lived a quarter of a millennium BC, recorded the history of Egypt at that time, and he wrote that after the flood, so this is before Christianity, right? This is in Egypt during the Greek period. In Egypt, we've got an Egyptian historian writing the history of Egypt under Greek culture, and what he says is that Egypt wrote that after the flood, Ham, the son of Noah, begat Egyptus, or Mesrom, who was the first to establish himself in the area now known as Egypt, at a time when the tribes began to disperse. Very interesting. So this is not Hebrew culture, this is not Christian culture. This is Greek, Egyptian, and there's Egypt, pyramids. The Grecians were referred to as the sons of Javan, another grandson of Noah, the second son of Japheth. Javan is also the Hebrew name for Greece, and this is used to refer. So there again, we find that we can trace the origin of Greek, that very ancient empire, and how it's named, to the Bible again. And Young notes that Japheth is probably the original Japtus or Elaptus, whom the Greek considered the ancestor of the human race. So even in their culture, in their mythology, we find it connecting with the Bible. Goes on, the Armenian writers ancient Armenian writers called the Armenians the descendants of Togarmah or Ashkenaz, the sons of Gomer, who were also the sons of Japheth. Japheth had another son called Magog. Josephus notes that the Magadites were called the Scythians by the Greeks, a people occupying southern Russia and the Ukraine. Another one of Japheth's sons and grandsons, Noah, was Madai, who, according to Josephus, was the father of the Medians, who were called the Medes by the Greeks. So here we see that these ancient historians link these ancient cultures with descendants of Noah. Another interesting finding is the Ebla tablets. And these tablets were discovered in 1974. Around 20,000 of them were discovered in northern Syria. And they had references to the land of Canaan and references to and Canaan was another son of Ham, another grandson, and he was the father of Sidon, and there was a lot of references there. But in particular, they talked about the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the secular world says, no, this whole story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is all pure myth. The Bible, that part of the Bible is pure myth. When the professor of Assyriology at the University of Rome first translated that and discovered that they mentioned those towns were listed there in these ancient documents as real towns, he was sacked. That's true. And when I tried to obtain his original articles, they had been deleted from those volumes of the journals of archaeology on the internet. And how I was able to obtain a copy of them was that there was a copy held by an archaeology lecturer at Monash Uni, and he had put them up on his website. And later this guy published a book as well. These 4 towns, which no longer exist, were only mentioned in Genesis and the Hebrew literature and were found to be named on the tablets, as were the other towns in the region. And the mention of the Canaan and the 4 cities of the plain provide very strong evidence that Genesis contains a factual, historical information. And that's the guy's name up there, Dr. Giovanni C. Pettinato, Professor of Assyriology at the University of Rome. And he's since published a book which came out published by Hopkins University Press. Because what happened was he moved then to the US and he was able to publish his work. And what he says in one of a subsequent interview is, he said, it's very interesting. It's almost as if there's a discerned effort out there to stop any evidence coming out that supports the historicity of the Bible. And that's, he writes about that. He said it's really, really strange. If anybody publishes something that supports the historicity of the Bible, they come under a lot of attack. The flood's also mentioned in the Sumerian king lists of the World Blundell Prism, which is discovered. Now, these king lists contain the ages of the kings. They give them living 30,000 years and 10,000 years, ridiculous ages, and they're all over the place. But they record, that's their history, and they record the flood as an actual historical event. I might talk about this. Do I talk about this here or in somewhere else? Okay, here, I think. So Dodwell was the Australian government, South Australian government astronomer who in the 1930s led the team of scientists up to Cordello Downs up there in the top of South Australia. You go through that on the way to Birdsville or the Simpson Desert, where they observed an eclipse of the sun that verified Einstein's theory that light would be affected by gravity. And what happened was that... how am I going for time? I'm telling stories about this. But, yeah, the obliquity of the ecliptic is just an astronomical name for the angle of the Earth's tilt, right? Don't be confused by that. And it can be easily calculated because it's halfway between the angle of the shadow of the sun at midday and the longest day and the shortest day. And so a lot of ancient monuments kept these records. Now, essentially what happens is this. The Earth is on this angle, but it wobbles on this angle as it precesses around the sun, because as it becomes closer and further to Jupiter and Saturn and so forth, the gravitation of the pull of these huge planets causes an extra wobble, which is calculated by Newcomb's formula, an American astronomer from about 1870. At the end of the 1800s, a couple of British astronomers, one the Royal Navy astronomer, another professor of astronomy at one of the universities there, noticed that there seemed to be an additional wobble over and above that predicted by Newcomb's formula. And that is what Dodwell went on to investigate. And what he showed was that there was this additional wobble that was superimposed. And what he did was he went and he collected astronomical data from Chinese and the Greeks and the Middle Ages and so forth. I think I've got a plot of it. No, it might come up in the next section. Yeah. And essentially, what happened was, when he plotted the data and separated it from the other wobble data, he got a declining sine curve. And it's sort of like this. If you take a pendulum out and you let it swing, it'll go back and it'll just slowly decrease in amplitude. Amplitude's the distance from the equilibrium position, right? So you got that. It's swinging backwards and forwards. So if you plotted that on a graph, that distance from that medium position, and you start from maximum displacement, you're going to get a curve like this, right? That is just slowly getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller till eventually it stops. Now, if you plot a log plot of that, you can actually calculate when the first major disturbance happened. And when he did that, he calculated that it occurred at 2345 BC, very close to the date of the flood. So here we have actual astronomical evidence that occurs a major catastrophic event occurred to the Earth about the biblical time for the flood. My personal view is that that is the time when the mountain ranges were put up and the tectonic plates moved, pushed up the ranges after the flood. But so that's data that we can calculate. What it means is my interpretation. That's not proven. But we have good data that some major catastrophic event affected the Earth at that time. Another thing is the decline in ages after the flood. Now, this is very interesting that we have the lifespans have been recorded. Now, what happened was that guy from Cornell University, John Sanford, who was a geneticist there, he plotted. So up the top here, we've got the ages here in hundreds of years, right? So before the flood, the Bible account says that they lived about 900 years, right? And then after the flood, they're the ages of the people that are plotted. And that's interesting because these are in different books of the Bible, different periods of time, but this decay curve here matches very closely the predicted decay curve for the increased rate of mutations occurring in the genetic code after the flood. And there's very, very good correlation occurring. Some people, for example, the commentator Ellen White says that this could be accounted for by the introduction of eating meat and the decline in the diet that way. There's an Ashtonian theory that at that time deuterium was released into the water supply. So deuterium oxide is heavy water because when we remove normal water is about 50 parts per million deuterium or heavy water, and that's why during the Second World War the Germans set up their big hydroelectric scheme to electrolyse water, because what happens is normal water, light water, is electrolysed first and you build up your concentration of heavy water, which has the neutrons which are required to moderate nuclear reactions. And so normal water, if we measure seawater, it's about 50 part per million deuterium. But one of the cancer treatments that is being developed and is currently registered in Europe now for treating veterinary for veterinary use only, is that actually if you remove the deuterium from water, and all cells are based on water, then cancer cells grow much more slowly and the rate of mutation is much more slowly. And it's interesting that in very ancient waters are much lower in deuterium. And so an Ashtonian theory, so this is where I can put forward a hypothesis, right, is that prior to the flood there was a very low deuterium content in the water and hence the long life expectancy. During the flood, when the fountains of the deep opened up and the higher concentration of deuterium was released from deeper in the earth into our water supply, that increased the rate of mutation and hence the decreased lifespan. Because we age, because our DNA accumulates mutations and replication errors, and that's why we age. Well, one of the main mechanisms that we age and eventually die from malfunction. So summing up, we've got massive sedimentary rock deposits worldwide that fits the flood. We've got massive fossil beds worldwide that can only be explained by a catastrophic water movement. Ancient flood accounts have been preserved around the world. Many towns and regions and countries spreading from Babylon have been named after Noah's grandson. The Genesis account is scientific realistic in terms of the length of the ark and the decline in lifespan and astronomical observations. So what we have is we have a lot of data that we can go out and measure now that supports the Bible account. But it's totally refutes evolution really overall. The evidence supporting evolution is not there in long periods of time. So in the next section, I'll talk about, we'll have our break now, I'll talk about the really critical issue of dating. What do we actually know? What can we actually measure now that can give us clues on the age of the earth? What is the best data we have? So that's what we'll talk about after the break.